a study finds video games with sexualized content do not cause misogynistic attitudes or body image issues. Now, before we get started, I want to point out that one of the easiest things to do in the world is lie with statistics. Bill Gates has proved that.
Especially pop psychology, which you can do based on surveys.
Yep. And the person who did this, in this article, the person who ran these studies is the same guy who did the violence and video game stuff in the 90s. But I think there's a good amount of validity to a lot of this, and I think a lot of it ends up being a lot of whataboutism. But we'll go through it. So it says, according to results of a recent study, psychologists have found that evidence is weak that sexualized video games influence player attitudes and behavior. Do you guys know, for instance, like... at what age do we start to kind of fall into those roles of how we're going to be towards the opposite sex? It would be probably, would it be around the same time as when you're getting into these types of video games?
I mean, it obviously like starts at birth because your parents are your first models for how like gender dynamics work and how you're supposed to interact with the opposite sex. But the media that we consume is so much more prevalent than previous generations, and like kids are getting parented in a way by the media they consume.
We talk a lot about like parental controls on Netflix and stuff like they're like, it's basically like your parents are using your Netflix and your YouTube as a way of co-parenting with them when they've got other stuff to do. And I don't know if Dane, do you think that video games fall into that same category?
I think maybe like when I'm a father, it would be because like I would be cognizant of like what the video games or like the companies would entail. But like to your normal like boomer parent that calls everything a Nintendo, no, like they have no idea. They as like our favorite Beanie Boss says, like parents dislike their children very much. Yeah. And like from what I'm noticing is like they'll do anything like not to spend time with them,
which is really sad. Like I imagine for anybody who actually like as I get older, the idea of family and what family means and having a family, which becomes much more of like a concern than it ever was for me in my 20s, as cliche as that may be. You know, like we were talking yesterday about like how I kind of came to the realization that you're going to have to homeschool your kids these days, like with the way the school system is. And just the kind of those realizations to me shows you how little people actually, you know, the average person, I think, actually pays attention to what's going on in their kids' life. And sometimes not even through, you might say through fault of their own, but just the way the world is designed now, where both parents have to work. And
I hate when people say it's your fault if your kid comes across like harmful content online, because
I agree with you. It's like completely out of their control.
Yes, like they should exercise as much discretion in what their kids are exposed to as they possibly can, but ultimately like I think we're finding that's still not enough, and
because the media is too prevalent and there's too much of it.
You have to pay as like equally as much attention to what you're modeling to your kids as parents in your day-to-day interactions as like the interactions that they view on a screen.
Yeah.
I think it's like an impossible standard like right now, because like when I was growing up, like the expectation was that I was a certain age, thus certain topics were, let's say, like above my understanding or like above like what I should be like knowing. That, I mean, in culture in general, like that belief has been completely discarded. Like this is like a niche group that like still holds that belief, but like it is very much niche to like current society. Like every cartoon is sexualized, video games are sexualized. Teachers like insist of sexualizing students and talking about their own personal.
Yeah, at the very least, talking about bringing up their own personal lives in school.
Since they're like 4.
Never made sense that never happened when I was a kid.
Me neither.
I'm going to go a little bit into the article here. So it says, set to have its results published in October 2022 edition of the journal of the journal Computers in Human Behavior under the title "Does Sexualization in Video Games Cause Harm in Players? A Meta-Analytic Examination." The recent study sought to address the oft-touted claims of the perpetually offended, such as disgraced critic Anita Sarkeesian and numerous gaming journalists, and answer the question of whether video games with sexualized content do or do not relate to mental health or body image problems in players, and or sexualization and hostility towards women. I'm really having a hard time with sexualization today. Sexualization, sorry.
Sexualization.
So, what's funny about this, not funny, but like, there's so many ways in which we're exposed to that type of content that video, like, would you really be able to pinpoint it as that's the only thing that's causing your kid to behave that way?
Right, because sexualization is being saturated in all content for kids right now.
Yep.
Regardless, like, because no topic is off limits at this point.
Yep.
And YouTube is like one of the biggest offenders in that way, that like we literally have AI generated kids entertainment on YouTube that's allowed to go up that has violent themes and sexual themes and like disturbing imagery.
I like to give my hypothesis as to why that, despite the fact that they're like women are, I don't want to say like overtly sexualized, but like without a doubt sexualized in the games, and why it wouldn't cause misogynistic attitudes.
Okay.
Body image issues, like I don't know, honestly, and like I think that Instagram is like such a stark competition in terms of like what actually causes body issues, that I think, you know, females that play video games are about like a drop in the ocean.
Yeah. Well, and like, I'm somebody who, like, my Instagram feed is filled with like gym bros and girls like that would give anybody body image issues if you don't have the time to go to the gym every day of the week for 2 hours a day. So it's not just video games.
Right.
It's on every level of our society now.
Correct. But like my theory as to why it doesn't cause misogynistic attitudes is because despite being sexually attractive, these people are not one-dimensional. And typically, they are the protagonist of the story, and thus they're not morally reprehensible people. So usually it's like attractive female characters who are both moral and likable, and thus, you know, it's like a moral, likable person that just so happens to be sexually attractive.
Yeah.
So that's why I think, you know, that
so you
it
think
really
that it appeals to them for more than just that reason. They just happen to also be attractive.
And if that's true, that would exactly counteract, I don't know if I can say this on YouTube, but like the Madonna whore complex, because which theorizes that men can only see a woman as a Madonna who is like morally virtuous and therefore non-sexual, or a whore who is just entirely deviant and is of a sexual nature, and that's completely one-dimensional on both sides.
I mean, according to history books and like past, you know, images that have been taken by photography, by drawing, women were both attractive and not disgusting morally. Mm-hmm. And so like the fact that now it's like it's somewhat rare, it doesn't mean that it's like impossible to be both. And like obviously I'm speaking in jest today and being a little edgy boy, but like, you know, like that isn't that like insanely condescending towards men, that we like if someone is beautiful before me, like I cannot evaluate anything else besides them. I can't evaluate their morals. Mm-hmm. I can't evaluate their intellect. I can't evaluate, you know, their general upstanding like contribution to society. It
expects less of the player, you being the example here. But what do you think of one of the picture examples here is from Final Fantasy 14? Mm-hmm. Did you play that?
Yeah.
And in this example, do you think that these characters were like not one-dimensional and they had like their own stories, therefore it wasn't
so I'm trying to look for
it wasn't like reducing them to
it's the second picture down, third picture down from the top.
The third, the one I'm
Final
getting
Fantasy
is
14.
Dragon Quest, which is the one I see. I don't see Final Fantasy 14. Oh, there I go. So actually these are probably like player generated characters. So like I wouldn't know, but for example, I can speak to the games that I have played, and Final Fantasy VII is a game that we referenced here.
Yep.
If you keep scrolling downwards, the character that's referenced there is Tifa Lockhart, and you know, she is a very. I feel like some people, what do the people call it, like Mary Sue or something?
Mary
Yeah, that's
Sue,
a-
yeah, that's doesn't need training to become the best at everything.
Right.
Yeah.
I think she is like far from
Flawless,
that
yeah.
because they speak of her like martial arts background in the context of the game. Like she is the protagonist like childhood friend, and her childhood friend is like literally going through a manic episode, and she's trying to like both manage him like and his episodes and like integrate him back into society. So it's like she is both stunning to the eyes and a good person, you know. And so, but again, there's other examples where they are intentionally sexualized characters, like the character that's in the top of the article that's called, she's like Mai Shiranui, and she is meant to like represent like a type of ninja whose battle style is to be distracting with her overt sexuality. So like, and she's more like of a typical like submissive, like marriage crazy, you know, like stereotype, like ancient Asian, I guess, like stereotype woman, but it is to fit her already like very stereotypical role. Yeah. So in those cases, like, yeah, you know, they're so cartoonish that you kind of like separate, like, you know, that this is a character that will not exist like within nature, or like would rarely exist within nature. But
well,
like,
it fits in a fictionalized world, but
right.
It's not something you expect to come across in the real world. It's not. It's a product of storytelling,
correct,
not of the real world.
Whereas Tifa is like a far more complex character that just so happens to be attractive.
So I'm going to read a little bit more of it, and we'll get just because I want to get into the bullet points of what they're talking about here. So it says, conducted by Christopher J. Ferguson, perhaps best known for his work debunking the similar claims that violent video games inspire violent behavior. James D. Sauer, Aaron Drummond, Julia Neer, and Emily Lowe. The study explored the degree to which sexualization in games was related to both well-being, body dissatisfaction, and sexism, misogyny among players in two separate meta-analyses. In doing so, the team reportedly found that the sexualization in games was neither related to well-being, body dissatisfaction, nor sexism/misogyny. Better designed studies and those that showed less evidence for researcher expectancy of effects for sexism and misogyny outcomes tended to find less evidence for effects. They explained. It says, as it appears commonly in other realms of media effects, the evidence is weak that sexualized games influence players' attitudes and behaviors. Psychology-centric news outlet SciPost explains that these conclusions were derived from a meta-analysis of 18 other studies, all measuring the results of exposing a subject to video games both featuring and lacking sexualized content. 15 of these measured aggression towards women along with sexist attitudes, while 10 measured factors including involved with depression, body image, or anxiety. So those are kind of two separate things that they're going through here. Whether we're talking about you're talking about body image issues that it might present towards women. This is talking about sexist attitudes that would be more, I guess, I'm assuming that would have to do with men, but I guess they could be, I don't know if they're also testing women here to see if they develop their own sexist attitudes towards other women.
My analysis of this is that in most of the examples that I'm seeing, like, these characters that are being sexualized to a point where it's like so outlandishly cartoonish that in nature you would not meet these people. And it really just goes to serve that, you know, it's a game and they're having fun, and usually it's from typically like more like Japanese developers. They don't have like the same proclivities that we have towards
we have a very western influence to how we look at these things.
And in fairness, like in some cases for good and in some cases for bad. Like for example, like Armika, that is like a Street Fighter character. She's like kind of like overt sexual point to like where it's like somewhat tasteless. But you know,
I want to push back on what you're saying in that these are like cartoonish, exaggerated characters, like nothing like anyone you would ever come across in real life, because last week we were talking about how TikTok is causing people to display symptoms of mental illness and tics like that of like Tourette's syndrome, and we're seeing that people are not actually interacting with the real world as much as they should. Now that's not our problem, and that's not a problem caused by like video game developers,
which is the main question they're asking here. But you're saying it does play a role.
And there's a big problem here, like in this conversation, which I think the title of the study addresses, because it's asking, does sexualization in video games cause harm in players? Usually the conversation is, do video game players cause harm to society? And it's automatically creating some kind of the players are the enemies, and then the rest of us are the normal people.
Yeah.
When like everyone has been poisoned by the same culture.
Okay.
And it's not, the question isn't being asked generally out of concern for the people playing the game.
More out of the desire to demonize them in the industry itself.
Yeah, and that has its own, commercial ends, like we've seen from.
And it was the same in the 90s with violence in video games.
Right.
It was the same questions were being asked. So it says, speaking to side post, Ferguson prefaced, I've been studying the effects of video games on players for 2 decades now, most of it on violence. I think most people have come to accept that there's no relationship between violent video games and aggression or violent crime, despite some holdouts, including the American Psychological Association. However, people still ask a lot of questions about sexualization and whether games either make male players more sexist towards women or whether women players experience more body dissatisfaction and other well-being concerns, Ferguson dismayed. It's a much smaller research field than the violence field, so we hope to bring some clarity to it. Overall, the moral panic over video games and sexualization is pretty much following the paint-by-numbers pattern of the video game violence debate, he continued. Lots of his hyperbole and moral outrage, but very little evidence that the video games are causing any harm to either male or female players. What's interesting about this is we have now come, full circle. I imagine that the people who are that you're going to get who are going to be making these complaints will be on the very, very in the 90s with the video games. It would have been conservative, religious, right-leaning organizations, the same ones that were trying to get Harry Potter banned from your schools. Now it is the Jezebels and the Voxes, the Slates and the Mary Sues of the world that want to do this because it happens to line up with their feminist ends of their arguments that they're making here.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's it's weirdly switched. The party's switched.
At
No?
last.
I have what I hope is a fresh take on the violence in video games debate, and then it's being carried over to sexual content. Violence in video games doesn't make people more violent. I think it makes, and also because people who play video games that aren't mobile games, they're mainly men.
Yeah.
We can say violence in video games does not make men more violent.
Men are more violent. Period.
I think it makes men less violent, and I think that's probably a bad thing because what you need is male violence in a controlled environment.
Jordan Peterson would agree with you.
And video games, I think, are leading certain men to believe that they're blowing off steam, and expressing that urge to roughhouse, to hunt, to fight in this controlled environment that's on a screen.
So you think it's filling
but it's
a need.
not satisfying the end that you think it's satisfying, and it's making you it's just suppressing the desire,
fulfilling a need without actually giving you an outcome that's beneficial.
Yeah, I think the simulated violence in video games is making men just suppress whatever urge they have to fight and hunt or let out that steam in a controed way.
Then is the same thing happening now with the sexualization of these characters?
Yeah,
is that
to
doing
carry
it with
it
men
over
in their sexual identity?
To carry it over, that's what I mean is maybe
But I feel like every intellectual pursuit is characterized that way. Like the same critiques that you are now giving video game players were once given to people that read a lot of books. It's like...
Well, what would be the thing that like reading fantasy suppresses in you? If anything, I think it frees something in you.
Well, it's not as much of like what suppresses and like how you let off steam as much as you are spending your time in a way that is not physical. Thus, all these like interpretations are made upon you.
But I would argue that maybe reading a book is superior because you're acting upon a book, and anything that's like digital media, I believe, is acting upon you. I think that it's very different.
Because one is more interactive, or because
reading a book requires you to put in a lot more mental effort.
Absolutely not. Than video games, absolutely not. Like, absolutely not. By the way, I am a literature and English major, and my hot take for the year is that reading is the most overrated form of consumption of the, and I would put my life behind this. Like,
I mean, truly. I don't even believe in mass literacy, and I still disagree.
Well, fine, but like reading is the most overrated method of data, intake. Videos are far superior, and audiobooks are like superior to that of reading.
Well, if you think data intake is the end of reading,
I mean,
I don't think it is.
It's that and entertainment. Like, what else is there? Education. What else is there?
Because none of us agree on what the words entertainment or education even signify anymore.
Well, but between us, like, I'm sure we had a closer definition.
I think the fact that like reading used to be something exclusive to upper class people, and education used to be something only accessible to nobility, shows that we place a very high value on it, and it's not for data intake, and it's not for diversion only. It's for edifying yourself at the deepest level, and it's just, when I say reading is requiring a lot more effort from the reader than video game or like digital media, video games in general require from the player or the watcher, I mean that
there's a bunch of reading in games. Like my proficiency in English comes exclusively from playing video games.
Yeah, I feel like there's maybe too much dialogue, right?
There's a lot of it, and like in old games, like there was no voice acting, so you would have to read.
What I mean is that it's requiring a lot more active imagination to not be seeing it in front of you. That's just true. I mean,
I think it's a different
especially when we're placing so much emphasis on like the insane graphics of this video game. It's like real life, when like, and in movies too, like with this CGI mess that we're seeing, like with Avatar 2, it's just like the CGI water looks almost real, like it's real water, when you could have just like recorded water.
So I want to ask one more question before we wrap this one up. So it says, obviously we go through these cycles of blaming media for social problems. Ferguson reminded, at least with fictional media, the evidence often reveals that we're probably scapegoating media, and fiction rarely causes social problems. Again, to be fair, advocating for better representation of females in games can be a worthy cause, even if the games don't have harmful effects. He concluded. He says, I support those efforts. I just hope advocates don't misrepresent. Oh, advocates. Okay, I was like advocates. Don't misrepresent the evidence as part of their efforts, which is unfortunately all too common among the advocacy groups. That's what you talked about earlier. That basically the idea is that it's the same thing. We're just going through the same thing over again. So is this a holdout of just the continual growth of social problems in our culture, and the breakdown of the family, and just the kind of the decline of the West anyway?
Why is that where we keep on ending our topic discussions? It's just that like everything sucks, and here's a symptom of it.
Because art imitates life, and life as it is right now is like a constant decline of values.
And I'm not trying to make it like depressing.
What I hate about this is like, this is a conversation that has a potential to actually help people or like show concern for like how our media affects us.
So what would you
And it just turns into like some kind of, again, like a proxy war for like social issues.
So okay, then you think that it's something that we could get to? Like, how would you think the media should go about doing that?
I don't know.
By
the
virtue of the media we choose to create?
The media is, do you mean like the media that covers this, or the media
that's being made,
that is being consumed? Like
I think we
games?
can all agree that the media that's being covered is going to be covered biased by everyone, because everyone has their own interpretation of these arguments. How do you think the media that's being created could be done to better affect change in society?
I mean, I hate that the end of like creating media at this point is like, how am I going to affect change in society with this? Like, why does that need to be the end of it when it actually like lowers the quality of the product because you had a preconceived notion of like what it can do to the real world? Like, it's very on the nose, and then it's not creative anymore. But like ultimately, I don't know if I'm like the best person to speak on that because I don't play video games.
Dane, do you think change things or leave them as they are?
I think that as a marketing man, I've learned that most people do not know what they want. And that is why algorithms are highly successful, because they study your behavior and deduce what you want. And usually they know better than the person itself. That could be a testament to the education system on the world as a whole. But I think the way for... I think this isn't as much an issue as the media, because like we are the media, you know, like we're media. I think it's more of an issue of artists and like how they have to stop trying to appeal to mass ideas and start having to appeal to ideas that are not being conveyed, because like there's only so many times that like Shakespeare can be like robbed and like done over again under a new like flesh and new name, and like people's like, it's original. Like we live in like brave and new times. Like let's have something that reflects the brave and new, and instead of like the old and contrived and boring and sterile.
All right,
that got very cerebral for a conversation about like video game characters wearing
anime
outfits
titties,
and like anime titties. Yeah.
Thanks for watching this clip, guys. If you want to see full episodes or follow us on social media, links are in the description below. Bye.
Bye.